Not long after I started the Casting Shadows blog, one of the first posts that I wrote that gained some traction among readers, meaning people read it and shared it, which was unusual at that time, was a post called On Fear, Discomfort, Terror, and Vast Cosmic Horror on a Dime a Day. And it sounds like it may have been comedic, but actually what it was outlining was a step-by-step developmental program for moving from not feeling comfortable running, let's call them horror games, to noticing that the horror games you're running have an effect and people enjoy them. Now, this proved to be one of a series of posts, and in different formats, about facilitating fear. And they come from the perspective that the game master does not scare the players. The players scare the players. The game master facilitates their ability to do so. So it's a very interesting and somewhat fragile kind of collaboration. And what that first blog post on fear and the subsequent ones on fear were trying to communicate were different and practical ways to, bit by bit, through practice, develop that ability to facilitate it. This podcast is not going to go through that post piece by piece. You can find it on castingshadowsblog.com if you're interested. You can also find linked there conversations that arose as a result of the blog post and other versions of the blog post that have appeared in different places. Instead, this podcast is going to look at two games, Call of Cthulhu and Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars, as looking at two extremes of this type of gaming. Things that we could tie, let's say, to self-protection as a very general term. Self-protection might make us feel afraid. They might make us feel fear. And the complete erasure of all that we understand as reality might make us feel horror. So from that perspective, we'll take these two games and talk about, mostly from the game master's perspective, but also from the player's perspective, what is going on in our agreement to play these games and find enjoyment in them. Subsequent episodes will look at different games, ones that don't involve a fear mechanic of any kind at all, but may involve fear, and other episodes that focus specifically on games that do involve fear mechanics and how we can work with them in harmony and in harmony with the group to get the results we're looking for, to even understand what results we might want. So I hope that sounds interesting, and I hope you'll join me for this exploration or re-exploration or reintroduction of a beloved topic. When I first encountered Call of Cthulhu and started to run it, as I've mentioned in other places before, but newcomers to me may not have heard me say it, this was the game that showed me my voice. This is where I found my voice. This is where I found the reaction and interaction with players that suggested that the sessions were more than just, hey man, good game. That really I could believe it had been a good game, and sometimes it had been a very good game, which is not a feeling that I had been accustomed to. I had just felt like an okay game master before that. I found my voice through horror games, and that, I think, I hope, is something of value that I can share with others. And in the act of sharing, particularly if it's reciprocated, find new things and new ways to enjoy my preferred genre better myself. So, without further ado, let's get down to the meat of it. And this, as an introductory episode, is a particularly meaty one. Okay, episode 7, on fear. Well, to keep things simple and to keep this from going on and on and on, let's take a look at role-playing games where fear can be a relevant part of a positive play experience. And we'll look at them from two perspectives. One where we are going toward horror, and one where we are going toward fear. Now, if we think about it, these are not just differing levels or differing amounts of a reaction. Horror is different from fear. They are definitely related and sometimes conflated. But for the purpose of this discussion, let us assume that fear is a reaction to circumstances which are dangerous and perhaps undesirable, whereas horror is an awareness of powerlessness and situations which are far beyond merely undesirable, but maybe moving toward the negation of life as you know it, at least yours. When playing a role-playing game where fear will be a regular element, such as a game like Call of Cthulhu, where we would expect at some point the characters at least should be afraid, there are times where not just times, there are lots of times where the personalities of the people that you're playing with matter. And this might be because a person can't take any situation seriously and so will be constantly, consciously or unconsciously, working against the goals of the group in playing a horror game. And there are the people who are far more sensitive than you think they are or they think they are, who wind up being actually disturbed and therefore still interrupting play. And obviously not having any fun if that is their reaction. If the reaction is so strong and so uncomfortable that they have to interrupt play, no one else is going to have a good time either. And we have, as a group, made a mistake. So I'm not going to keep emphasizing this as we move through. It turns into a long string of caveats. From my perspective, play is best when played with friends. And so, knowing yourself, knowing what it is that you intend to contribute to play, and knowing your players and what it is that they are likely to contribute to play, passively and actively, any pitches of games which could affect people negatively should not be made. And any pitches which will lead to failure and therefore not fun should be reconsidered. At very least, the construction of the membership of the group should be reconsidered. If there's just one player who just refuses to contribute positively to horror or fear-based gaming, then we have a choice, don't we? Play the game without them, or don't play the game. Only you can answer which one of those is of particular value for your group. Some other person on the internet can't possibly give you good advice about that. So, with that firmly before us, but no longer to be mentioned in the podcast, if we have these two versions of fear to talk about for example's sake, horror and fear, when we look at the game, we need to recognize what it is going to be best at producing. So if we are thinking along the lines of a shotguns versus shoggoths, right? Bringing violence to the monsters with a reasonable chance of success, then we're not really talking about horror. We're talking about fear from this perspective. And if we're talking about the risking of everything, the sacrifice of everything to prevent, right, cosmic horror from descending from beyond the stars because the time is finally right and we are very likely to fail, and if we fail, then life as we know it will be wiped out. Then what we're talking about is horror. And it might be interesting to realize that there might not be a lot of fear in a horror game. And there might not be any horror in a fear game. I think this distinction, while possibly confusing, can be helpful. Now, I said we would talk about a couple of different games. In Call of Cthulhu, fear and horror, whichever it is, however it is that you approach playing it, are represented by the sanity mechanic. And so ultimately, the reaction in the game is a wearing down of the investigator's ability to continue. Their mental state becomes more and more fragile as they encounter things which they were not supposed to encounter, right? The cosmically malign entities from beyond humanity's normal perceptions. From a certain point of view, the game doesn't really tell you, this is the point where you are afraid. What it does tell you is, this is the point where your character's sanity is affected. Now, we think of it as a horror game. We think of the mythos as being related to horror, and that's good. That's a good connection to make. When we connect it directly to sanity, your investigator is going crazy now. Your investigator is crazier now than they were a few minutes ago. And your investigator is now an NPC because they are completely crazy. When we think about that, we haven't really been talking about fear. We've been talking about the effect of horror. What you might find in play is players eyeing their character sheet, looking at the ever-dwindling sanity resource, and hesitating. It has an effect on behavior. I don't want to read the dusty old book because it may negatively impact my sanity. I don't want to go up into the attic because there's something that's obviously not human thumping around up there, and when I see it, my sanity is likely to take a hit. We find, in a sense, it can be like resource management. So where, then, comes the juicier enjoyment of horror? Well, unsurprisingly, this is a collaboration. Imagination on the side of the player and description on the side of the game master. This isn't terribly different if we're looking at this from the fear side, where encountering something horrible is going to lead to combat and conflict rather than mind-shattering losses of sanity. There also, what we are looking at, what we can see, is players assessing the size and the description of the creature to determine what to try and kill it with. It can become like any other combative game. Where is the fear? Like with horror, this is a collaboration, a willingness among the players to imagine deeply what it would be like if such a thing were real. And for the game master to describe things in such a way as to help the players lose their sense of certainty and confidence in what the game system is telling them. Interestingly, we can make use of one technique to serve both environments or atmospheres of play, and that is a very careful consideration of how to relay information to the players and how much and what kind of information it should be. For these examples, we'll use Fantasy Flight Games' Star Wars, which is not a game that incorporates horror, at least not as printed. Maybe your game includes horror, but we're not going to be talking about your game, at least right now. If you'd like to talk about your game, feel free to share details in the voice messaging options or by contacting me by other means. But to continue on, Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars, because it is based in Star Wars, includes mechanics that help to inspire description and understanding of fear reactions among the players. And if we think about Star Wars just on a surface level, we think, hey, this is science fantasy, this is space opera, this is laser swords and princesses and strange mystical powers. There's no fear, but of course there is. And there's fear in each of the films. We can see it in Star Wars, A New Hope, in several situations, some of them very brief and portrayed in a slightly comedic way, but some of them very seriously, most notably the trash compactor. Imagine being attacked by something you can't see under the surface of water. You can feel it moving around. You can see ripples. You can kind of hear it. But, something under the water is moving and it's huge. And then one of your number is pulled beneath the surface. There is a reason for the fear mechanic. Consider in later films where we find giant space monsters and we find the Rancor and we hear tales of the Krayt Dragon, and of course Darth Vader isn't done up like Darth Vader to be a welcoming presence like a greeter at Walmart. He's designed head to toe to inspire fear in those who see them, and certainly those who oppose him. So the fear mechanic has very specific use, but this is a type of heroic play. This is a type of heroic pulp, this space opera, this science fantasy. So fear in this environment isn't there to cripple the character, to break their sanity, to send them spiraling down into the inevitable decay because that is not a part of the source material. Instead, it is to provide feedback and provide more description to increase the challenge and to help us take one more step closer to occupying a point of view where we can almost see through the eyes of the character if we choose. Fear. There are reasons for fear, and the way that it's handled in the game is precisely that, to look at the person who's supposed to be feeling the fear and to interpret the object or source of the fear from their perspective, meaning as you go around the table for the different characters seeing the same thing, they might not be given the exact same role to resist the fear. The fear itself may be different from them. And they give a very clever example in Force and Destiny in particular, which is, imagine that player characters see someone in black combat armor with a cloak, looking not wholly different, not entirely different from stormtroopers. It's some kind of stormtrooper, but in black. That would be fairly frightening. It might be slightly more frightening if that particular viewer knew about Death Troopers. But it will be much more frightening if they know exactly who it is. This is Vader. So I think that's an excellent way to look at fear and its connection to the characters as people. Now, what do these results do? Let's say you roll and succeed, but have threat. Well, then, perhaps this is representing emotional strain. And in this context, we know exactly what the emotion is. It's fear. We know what fear does to us. It makes it harder to do things, or it causes us to panic and want to leave the environment that's causing the feeling. And if you consider the mechanics of play and realize how quickly the strain threshold can be reached, that's exactly what we can describe. That's exactly what's being modeled. It's interesting. If we fail, then tasks actually get harder. Maybe setback dice are applied, or maybe difficulties are actually upgraded. It's excellent. It's not very difficult. It doesn't require a lot of discussion at the table. It doesn't require any more discussion at the table than any normal role does, and it has relevant effects which help shape play. But unless a role is with an extraordinarily high difficulty and a character is particularly vulnerable, such as having very low cool or discipline ratings, then the chance for a character to be frozen or rooted to the spot in terror, to, in other words, have their actions stripped away by fear, is negligible. So fear becomes part of the action rather than a barrier or prevention to action. And this is important in heroic games. So if we compare this example to other games where the characters are wielding weapons versus supernatural threats and horrors, it is this kind of model that we are trying to follow. One where the characters will always be able to act, but the onus is on the players to have them act knowing that regardless of their ability to continue to fight, the characters are afraid. Notice that I keep reiterating it's the characters that are afraid. What is going to make the player feel fear? Well, the answer to that is really interesting because that is the player. The game master is really, for all intents and purposes, not going to be able to cause fear in the player unless the player is open to feeling fear. And there's a wide wide variety of things that they might feel fear about. It might simply be fear of loss. They've grown attached to the character and they don't want to lose it. So they're not afraid in the sense of seeing something scary. They're afraid in the sense of something's going to be taken away from them if they're not careful. Maybe this type of reaction will be the only one you see as a fear reaction through years of playing. But as you focus on being a good facilitator for fear, you can help reduce the barriers to the players being willing to experience what we call bleed from the character into themselves. A willingness to consider the possibility of what would it be like. And that's interesting. Kind of a lofty goal from some people's perspectives, and something that happens every week in the weekly game from other people's perspectives. So your mileage on that may vary. On the other side of our artificially constructed coin for this podcast, we have horror. And horror, as we said earlier, is not just more fear. It is a different experience. And one of the key elements there is to be in the opposite situation of the action heroes we were just talking about. Because in a situation where we have agreed to play a horror game, we are understanding that at a certain point we may not be able to act, or if we can act, our actions may be useless. And some people might question, well, why would you want to play that game? Well, obviously, the answer is not tied to action. It's tied to something else. And often that is the experience of the character, the perspective or the perception of what it would be like. That becomes the goal, the experience of the moment on some level, whether this be a purely theoretical level where you are imagining, like you would maybe when reading a book, what that might be like. It might be deeper than that. There might be a stronger connection, but all of that is going to rely on your comfort with the game and how easy it is in that particular moment to become more and more and more engaged with what is being described rather than the people who are describing it or the place where it's being described. And that's not always easy. Horror games ask a lot of players. And a lot of the time, people who have very lofty goals for horror games may feel some disappointment. They may feel like there is an awful lot of levity, and it may not be, that gallows humor of people who know that they're going to die. Instead, it might be more like sitting around with your buddies watching a very bad horror film, a very bad slasher film, something like that, where people are laughing at the special effects and not even really jumping at the jump scares. You may come away from a horror game feeling like, well, it wasn't scary, but at least people had a good time. They laughed a lot. And for some people, that's all games like Call of Cthulhu ever amount to, is just, a twinkle in the eye and a smirk and nothing really taken seriously. But there are others for whom it can be a very disconcerting experience. Possibly not in the it's really me and I'm really disconcerted sense, but at least in that I'm playing my character, and if I were where my character is, I would not want to be doing what my character is doing. Level of bleed. It's difficult to think about a horror game without putting yourself in the shoes of the characters. And I think that's interesting, where it's quite easy to talk about fear without it. What would the character do if they are afraid? Well, maybe it's not altogether different from what they would do if they're simply in combat. And we think, well, combat is, of course, it's frightening. And then we should ask ourselves seriously to consider how often do we actually portray that aspect of it in any of the games we play that involve combat. How often is characters taking care in the sense of people who don't want to get parts of their bodies blown off or eaten off or gnawed off or burned off or whatever would do if they were real. Maybe your group does. Maybe your group plays with a lot of concern, and that's awesome. But there are many who don't. Many for whom the idea of including an emotion feels a little alien, even if all they're doing is supplying fearful dialogue or having a conversation about having been afraid. In a horror game, there is a certain fragility to the atmosphere, which is obviously very easily dispelled. And so everyone who has agreed to play that kind of game in that way, because they think it will be enjoyable to do so, really must be aware of how easily that atmosphere can be dispelled. It's a habit. It requires practice, just like any other skill. So, I mentioned that in both cases, horror and fear, a methodology, a useful methodology, is to control information. And this is, interestingly, a skill which applies to a lot of play. But there are people who, especially when we're dealing with fear and horror, who become bothered by the idea that information might be controlled in the way of limiting it. So if we consider the situation of a ghoul, okay, let's imagine a creature that eats the flesh of your species. All right. So we might think that the ghoul arose from the same stock as our species. Maybe this is a supernatural game that we're playing, and ghouls are either twisted versions of humans who have been corrupted by some other force or by some deeds that the source material considered to be, too foul to exist unpunished. Or we might think of a ghoul as just a completely different species, which happens to feed on, the living or dead flesh of whatever species you are. So not necessarily a cannibal, but something that you don't really want to hang out with because they're viewing you as dinner. So we can imagine a situation where there is a ghoul, and we're in the ghoul's territory, and everything is set up to benefit the ghoul, and we, if it were real, would definitely be wishing that we weren't there or that we were well armed. Because if one thing might be true about the ghoul is that they're not terribly dissimilar in form from us. In a fear-based game, we're worried about who's going to be able to kill whom first. In the horror-based game, we are concerned with what the creature has done, who the creature used to be, or maybe could be again. And we are, of course, worried that we ourselves may follow in that creature's path. But it is neither horrifying nor a source of fear to say, there's a ghoul at the end of the street, roll initiative, or something to that effect. And so it falls on us to facilitate fear by controlling what the players can be confident about. In the action-based, shotguns versus whatever situation, we want the players to be able to make good decisions about the actions that they're taking. We also want them to know that they're going to be facing penalties from things like darkness, cover, rough terrain, right? They will be able to understand that it's difficult. They will be making fear checks. They'll be realizing that if a fear check is called for, and this is really important, this is something to which people must agree and follow through on. If a fear check is called for, if a sanity check, if a horror check, or whatever it is that is the game system's way of signaling you, follow through on the signal. If the fear check is called for, it doesn't matter what you roll. This is a frightful situation. There was a reason why you had to make a fear check, or whatever, in this scene, and you didn't in the scene before it. Success on the check doesn't mean the character feels no fear. Success means that they are able to act. And in a game like Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars, it's talking about how well they'll be able to act. They can act without any penalties whatsoever because they are trained, or they have faith in their abilities as a whatever. They have faith in the brand new armor that they just bought. They are going to be able to act, and the fear check is showing us the degree that fear is affecting them, from I'm afraid to I'm hampered by fear. There is no, if we want fear to have meaning, there is no moment where the fear isn't present. In a horror game, this works exactly the same way. The roll is called for, and this is something which a character in this environment, right? A character in the source material would be profoundly affected by what is happening. And again, it does them a disservice to say, hey man, there's a ghoul at the end of the street, roll initiative. And so we talk about what they can almost see. We can talk about the movements they can almost discern. This podcast won't be long enough to go into great details, but you can find specific details about this on castingshadowsblog.com and really a lot of other resources, both printed and non-printed. Fear is a topic that people talk about. Not everybody gets everything. Not everybody has played with every type of player. So it makes good sense to go out there and investigate how other people talk about it, and then take all those tools back and assess what's going to work with the game your group wants to play and the people who are in your group. So we limit information. We don't deny necessary information, but we help them feel that sense of not knowing enough, that sense of uncertainty, and all of those things help us to move to a place where we understand what's going on an emotional level. And like calls to like. As we are trying to imagine the situation appropriately for the type of game we're playing, tactically on one side and more philosophically on the other, as we're trying to piece together our imagined images of the scene from the description that's coming in, and recognizing that there are things that are obscured, that are hidden, that are hiding, that could be suggesting something awful is about to happen, then it's very easy to turn that process into the foundation of fear. And it's fun. So, this has been long. Let's recap. In a game like Call of Cthulhu, it is helpful to move through different layers of emotional effect. It's very helpful to have something like a mostly mundane investigation into a disappearance, only to discover it was something terrifying or something frightening. It doesn't always have to be huge cults and world-ending events. It may be something as simple as a disappearance, but that disappearance might be something at least slightly comprehensible. Murder, or less comprehensible, murder by a multiple murderer, or less comprehensible, murder by a serial killer. Or maybe something completely beyond expectation. It might be some creature from somewhere. We can facilitate fear by helping players never really being sure what kind of situation their characters are in. Is this one of those missing persons cases, or is this the beginning of a globe-spanning adventure to save all of humanity? Or both. On the other side, with fear in a game like Star Wars or Palladium's Beyond the Supernatural, where there's an expectation of action against the horror, we still limit the information. We provide the understanding that even though I am afraid, I can still act. We understand that bravery, that courage, is not the absence of fear. It's the ability to act despite fear. We understand that training leads to more control, but that after the moment is over comes reaction. And these things can enrich our role-playing experience. But the key point to be taken away is that no game master is going to be inflicting fear upon their players. No one will be afraid in these environments without their own willingness to be afraid. The Joker in the corner is not going to be terrified unless you startle them physically, and that's you startling them. It's not your game terrifying their character and as an enjoyable product of play, frightening them as well. The situations should be those which cause thought, which disturb, which lead to understandings that we normally wouldn't think about, which cause us to question motives and motivations, which cause us to imagine things we would rather not, which, because this is a role-playing game, lead us to decisions which, if it were us for real, we would not want to make. And if we can build that foundation for play, then the players can meet us halfway. We have facilitated fear so that they can enjoy the thrills and shocks and scares and horrors of play. Not all games include emotional mechanics. Some go very, very far, such as Pendragon, which is not entirely a game about fear. Or is it? Some games seem to be based completely in the experience of fear, such as Call of Cthulhu. But there are moments for action there too. Okay. I hope that this has been the start of a conversation and that the things I have said have provoked the desire to respond. Until next time. You have been listening to episode 7 of the Casting Shadows podcast. This episode was about fear, and this is a topic to which we will return more in the future. How is it possible that we could possibly say more on fear? Well, let's find out together. Episode 8, which will be along in a little while, we'll be talking about, in a sense, the opposite of today's topic. We're going to look at a horror game, a game that includes supernatural terrors. It includes, soul-damning magic, and is in a low-technology kind of environment where physical peril is extremely life-threatening. We're going to take a look at Triple Ace Games' All for One, Régime Diabolique, one of my favorite games, and one not really mechanically interested in enforcing a sense of horror, but yet one which is intended to be a supernatural horror musketeers game. So what does it really mean that there's no horror mechanic automatically in a game like All for One? And how can it be played so that fear is still there? Or, shall we say, in whom will we find the fear? Anyway, that's episode 8. See you then. Casting Shadows can be found in written form on castingshadowsblog.com, in video form at youtube.com/runeslinger, on Twitter at twitter.com/runeslinger, on Facebook at facebook.com/runeslinger. Take care.